Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early morning briefing for Thursday, the 10th of October, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We did hear from Robert. Robert's out today because he's dealing with some storm issues left over from Hurricane Milton. He is there in the central Florida region. And these two hurricanes, Hurricanes Helene and Milton, that's where we're going to start off today. I'll bring Mark on just for a brief update. One of the big problems that we've talked about, Mark, is what happens to the election for North Carolina, now for Florida. A lot of people are going to be displaced. It is going to have an impact at some level on the vote. So what's going on in North Carolina?
Yeah, so the Trump campaign has been monitoring this really closely. Just for perspective, this is about the area affected. That's like 8% of the vote for all of North Carolina. And these are 25 counties. They're deeply Republican, went strongly for Trump in the last election. So the Trump campaign has been monitoring this. Like I said, they're very concerned that this will affect the voting for the people that live there. Consider that when you talk about mailing someone their ballot, or if they're registering to vote, if the post office is gone or inoperable, or they don't have a mailing address, this deeply affects their ability to vote. So what the Trump campaign did is the Trump campaign proposed 10 measures in which North Carolina legislators could take that would allow greater voting access for folks that live in the affected areas. As it turns out, North Carolina was able to take those 10 measures, most of which they put into an emergency relief package, and they just approved that. So if the legislative package, everything goes through, we'll see some major changes in North Carolina that could potentially allow these people who have been affected greater voter access. The only thing that I'll add to this that might be kind of an issue, though, is that nothing is perfect, and there are still people that are displaced that even with the changes will still be unable to vote. So this really does kind of pose a question on whether North Carolina will turn into a swing state thanks to Hurricane Helene. I guess we'll just have to wait until November to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is pretty concerning to me. I just looked this up. Trump won North Carolina in 2020. Won it by less than 2 points, fewer than 2 points. Also, Florida. Trump won Florida by 3 points. So this is a big, major deal here. Also, looking ahead here, just at Florida, I was just looking through some numbers. With Hurricane Milton hitting the central Florida region, the greater Tampa region produces over 40% of the entire United States supply of ammonium phosphate, 32% of phosphate rock, which are fertilizers. Port Tampa Bay, that's where Florida receives about 40% of its fuel, so mostly diesel and gasoline. This is going to be backed up for weeks to months. They don't even know. I haven't seen any solid information about the damage, but it was really close to the eye of the storm. That's going to at least be backed up for a while. Also, Duke Energy Florida President Melissa Sejas said the company 2 weeks ago replaced hundreds of electrical transformers following the damage from Hurricane Helene. Presumably, they will be replacing them again due to the damage. So this double whammy is really, really tough for Florida. And Mark, do you think this could even potentially flip? Again, Trump won Florida in 2020 by 3 points. I mean, is this a potentially flipping Florida potentially for Harris here in 2024?
My gut tells me that Trump still has Florida, but when I look at the numbers, like you brought up, when I look at the areas affected, I mean, you're dealing with, Sarasota versus St. Pete. I mean, these are opposites really when it comes to the voting. And then I just, with how close it can be with these tight margins in these swing states, I don't think we can really be too comfortable on determining he has it in the bag, whether it's North Carolina or Florida. Something interesting that's happened in Florida as well is they've already been having some lawsuits brought up to try to ease voter access in certain areas. And I guess the latest update I had is that a judge just denied a request for, loosened restrictions on the voting. So, I mean, this is going to, regardless of what happens, this is going to be a dogfight, I think, in both North Carolina and Florida, with both campaigns watching it very closely. It could be incredibly tight.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, just before the show, you were talking about voter fraud, and you explained voter fraud is not just a big red button you push. It's really a localized problem, to paraphrase what you said. Can you just take us through also, take the viewers through what you said before the show, please?
Absolutely. Something, I've worked with this before. My background, I worked on the Senate Rules Committee. We dealt with voter fraud. Thing to understand is voter fraud does happen, but it happens in a more localized sense. Now, we've seen states making major changes with on the legal front. This is a huge issue, and also with like election centers, so where the votes are being counted and taken to one location. That kind of poses a whole new problem set. But the thing to remember is that voter fraud, when it does happen, it is localized. When you have election boards at a local level that are not keeping the rules, that are not doing things correctly, sometimes that they commit voter fraud, this is a localized issue. What I do see often from the public is this idea that the deep state has a red button that they push and that it flips an election. It's not quite like that. It's not that simple. This is why, for example, the Trump campaign, which made allegations of voter fraud in the last election, why they're deploying teams of lawyers, election officials, and people watching. And then there's also kind of a grassroots movement to try to put people in place that you trust at the local level to ensure that these elections are done correctly and fairly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, major point of contention also, looking ahead to November. All right, Mark, thanks for that. Very interesting also. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here. U.S. Army North has mobilized active duty Title X troops and equipment to assist with the Hurricane Milton response and recovery efforts there. That is at FEMA's request. The response force consists of 30 high-wheeled vehicles, 100 active duty troops, and several medium-lift helicopters are going to be operating out of Fort Moore. I think Fort Moore, you'll have to excuse me. I believe that's Benning. Yes. All right. Benning there in South Georgia, in support of these affected areas. Also, U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm said that the country is expected to see a 15% increase in power demand on the electrical grid as a result of these hundreds of data centers planned over the next decade. This, honestly, I think 15% is a low ball. I mean, Bank of America just came out a couple of weeks ago and said the country may need as much as 300 gigawatts. I mean, that's almost, I think in July we hit a new power demand record, and it was like 470 gigawatts. So if Bank of America is saying we need, take 470 and then add another 300, I mean, we're looking at almost double, or getting pretty close to double there. All right, and then also speaking of Fort Benning, a bipartisan group of lawmakers is vowing to resist efforts to restore Confederate base names following Trump's pledge to reverse the base name changes. So apparently they are trying to make sure that does not happen. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump over here to the global sit rep. We will bring Jared on. Jared, welcome back. Let's go ahead and jump into this. We've been talking about for several years now, talking about this concept of a global NATO, where we have a European, North Atlantic NATO, bringing in countries like South Korea and Japan, working more closely with Australia in the Indo-Pacific. And the Chinese have not taken too lightly to this. They've really been pushing back. So most recently here, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, yes, the never let a crisis go to waste, Rahm Emanuel, is recommending that U.S. Asian allies have the equivalent of an Article 5 where it concerns the economies of the Indo-Pacific. So what's going on?
Yes, and he's bringing this up, citing specifically debt trap diplomacy, which we saw in Sri Lanka, economic coercion, which we saw with Australia, and dumping subsidized good, which we're seeing with steel. Emmanuel also recommends a much more aggressive U.S. economic statecraft in order to, and I'm quoting here, mimic the successful containment of the Soviet Union. Now, this matters for quite a few reasons. First off, having an ambassador of the U.S. say the word containment is definitely going to trigger the Chinese, since they run an anti-containment narrative inside of China and constantly accuse the U.S. of containment. But this also strikes me as a softer sell of the Asian NATO idea that the new Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Shiba really ran on and wants to actually make. I think this is likely meant to counter a lot of the recent pushback that he's gotten. He received some pushback in Japan. There was a lot of pushback outside of Japan, particularly in South Korea. So this may be kind of a foot in the door for an Asian NATO. And one way I think they could bring this into fruition that I didn't see talked about anywhere else was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That was, I believe it's 14 or 15 countries all working together to build up supply chains anyway, if they can somehow work in additional rules and duties for those members, because they are actual members. We could end up seeing an equivalent of an Article 5 installed there.
Mm-hmm. Within the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
Yes, and it's all built right there for it. It's all of the U.S. allies. This would, at the very least, the bones are there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let me get this straight. You have a case where China, let's say, starts dumping Chinese steel into a country to undermine, and maybe Chinese steel is not even a great example, but Chinese tires or something. That China started dumping their tires on the U.S. markets back during Obama. It led to a very short trade war. But this is what they're talking about. China tries to effectively bankrupt a specific industry, a competing industry in country X, which is economic warfare. And then so Rahm Emanuel saying we need the Indo-Pacific framework to levy sanctions. Exactly how are they going to weaponize a response against China?
So it would be weaponized. It would be, mass sanctions along with cutting off, that particular product if it is a subsidized good. For the economic coercion one, I think that's probably the most likely, just because China does do exports for everybody, and they cut off a whole lot of stuff for Australia when Australia questioned the COVID narrative. So in the event of something like that, it would probably again be sanctions, but also simply refusing to buy from China on whatever goods that they are attempting to sell.
All right, interesting. Let's move on over to, actually, I'm still working on this report. I was watching actually listening to a very interesting interview yesterday from Ray Dalio. I follow Ray Dalio very closely. He has a lot of good things to say. He's a billionaire. Bridgewater was for many years the world's largest and most successful hedge fund. Ray Dalio makes billion-dollar bets with other people's money, and he's made himself a billionaire doing that. He's one of the best in the world at it. That's why I listen to him. And so in this interview, he talks about China, which I'll bring up here. He describes the U.S. debt situation as a ticking time bomb, and he's asked whether Harris or Trump will have a plan to deal with the growing U.S. national debt. And he said no. He said, quote, "First of all, the debt will not be dealt with." Kicking the can down the road, he calls it a ticking time bomb. And he goes on to say that the federal government, the Treasury, is going to be paying back these Treasury bonds he says, quote, "They're not going to be paid back in hard dollars," which is a way of saying the Fed is just going to print money so that the federal government can pay back these bonds upon maturity. And so just one of the things here that I want to bring up, Ray Dalio talks about China. He says, quote, "There's something big going on. Are they as favorable to capitalism as they are before? I do not believe they are in the same way. So there are structural changes taking place that have to do with the government's desire to retain complete control. I think what you're going to see is China," or excuse me, he says, it's a little bit disjointed because he's giving an off-the-cuff talk here. He says, quote, "I think what you're going to see in China is I'd be long." In other words, long on China. Dalio is a big believer in China. The Chinese dream, he educated his son, who very sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Educated his son in China, and he is just a big Sinophile. And Jared, I bring this up because we're talking about economic warfare here between China and these U.S. allies / Western countries here. And I was just thinking, under what conditions could Ray Dalio be so sure of betting on China? One of the things that we've talked about too is the reason why China is not buying long-dated bonds from the United States anymore, at least not in the levels they were, is because in 30 years, they know in 30 years, they're going to be paid back the nominal value, whatever, of the bond in dollars, in inflated dollars. And so, I just look at this and it's just a little bit more confirmation. The United States and China are locked in a capital war. They are locked in a technological war. They're locked in a diplomatic war, in an economic war. And, how much longer is it going to be until we're locked in an armed conflict with China? So my point is, Ray Dalio, if he's going, you just look at what's ahead for the rest of the decade. Taiwan, irreconcilable differences over Chinese claims to the South China Sea against their neighbors like Vietnam, encroachment into their neighbors' waters like Vietnam, Philippines. We have the first island chain that includes these southern islands of Japan. We've got a second island chain that reaches out to Guam. China very clearly has aspirations towards taking the second island chain as well. We're really talking about World War type conditions here with a lot of different countries. And so my big question is how can Ray Dalio be so sure of his bet on China, given our future relations with China, what they're going to be? And I've really arrived at two conclusions. Number one, he doesn't believe that the United States and China are going to war, which is possibly, maybe we don't. Or he believes that ultimately China is going to come out on top of the United States. And I honestly believe that's what he thinks. So, I'm not necessarily asking for comment or feedback, but I've just been working on this report. This is the economic early warning report that'll come out on Friday. But really thinking through the reasoning for Ray Dalio. And just to reiterate, the big reason why I think Ray Dalio is so bullish on China is he thinks the Chinese dream is going to beat the American dream. He thinks China's going to come out on top. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on. Speaking of Taiwan, the Taiwanese president came out and reiterated that Taiwan is not just going to let China bulldoze Taiwan in their diplomatic relations with foreign countries, or physically bulldoze the country of Taiwan. So what's going on?
Yes, this was part of Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te's National Day speech that was today, so early this morning, overnight. And there was something unusual about this. The Taiwanese government actually issued a warning that China would launch new drills near Taiwan in response to the speech, ahead of the speech. Don't normally see that. Even before his inauguration address, we didn't see that. And China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they rather expectedly, they immediately condemned it. However, they did say that this speech is deliberately severing the historical ties between the two sides of the Taiwan Straits. That is a verbiage I haven't seen from them before. That sounds like they're taking this as a full-on declaration of independence, where previously it was always moves towards independence or independence adjacent. So I do expect a pretty severe Chinese military drill in the near future here around Taiwan. Whether or not that will lead to an immediate blockade and quarantine, I can't say. I haven't seen the movements in the last few days. I still have to catch up on that. But it is worrying.
All right, so we're seeing rhetoric that is an early warning indicator. Also, one of the things we've seen just over the long term, China trying to cut off diplomatic access to Taiwan from other countries, essentially encouraging other countries to cut diplomatic ties and no longer recognize Taiwan as a separate entity away from mainland China. More recently here, we've also been seeing India get a little bit more involved, especially as a military counterbalance to China in the region. India is an aspirational naval power. Not there yet, but they're working towards it. More recently here, the Taiwanese are reaching out to India, I guess, to help counterbalance China in a different way. What's going on?
Yes, I found this exceptionally interesting. It was Taiwan's foreign affairs minister and his number two going at two different ways to do this. The foreign affairs minister appealed to India to economically counterbalance China by opening up Taiwanese investment opportunities in India. And that includes basically just, hey, find us a way to move TSMC. That's really the big thing there. But the deputy foreign affairs minister went on the war route, saying that if China successfully conquers Taiwan, then India is next, or at least in the eventual. Specifically saying that Japan and the Philippines will have to also be partially conquered. So, and then India would be immediately following. And that actually tracks really well with something that that we found from, I think it was Xi Jinping's first year in office, where he had a whole plan laid out that did include territory from India for how he wants to reunify China.
Mm-hmm. I've not, now granted, I'd pay attention only peripherally to the Indians, but I have not seen this type of bellicose rhetoric coming out of India before. And again, I don't read stuff every day. Would you say the conditions there are worsening, Jared?
It's hard to get a read because they, like you said, they're not normally very bellicose. However, seeing over the past few weeks, we've covered them, constantly bringing up the border issue that was kind of dead for the last 4 years. It does seem like it is worsening.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's skip over to Iran. We're still waiting on this Israeli response to the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel that happened late last week or so. And one of the big questions is Israel going to attack nuclear targets in Iran? Are they going to attack oil infrastructure? Both of those could be potentially at least disruptive, maybe catastrophic. I've seen some people float even Israel going after senior leaders, basically trying to assassinate some members of the senior Iranian clerics, for instance, in order to try to induce regime change. I think that's one of the most dangerous courses of action, but it's a possibility. Yoav Gallant was in D.C. Also, he's the Israeli defense minister. Netanyahu was also met with Biden, I believe yesterday, the day before. So these are very clearly very, very high-level meetings, almost certainly focused on the fallout after this Israeli strike that apparently still is imminent. Yoav Gallant said it's going to be surprising. He said it's going to be deadly. And he said Israel, under no uncertain terms, Israel is going to attack Iran. We're just waiting to see at what level. With that, Iran has started talking about nuclear weapons as a way of maybe Israeli deterrence here. That is an Israeli red line. So what's the latest here, Jared?
So Iran's state media is running a pro-nuclear weapons narrative campaign. They're citing a growing acceptance of Iranian nuclear weapons, as Iran has already paid the price for it anyway, quoting them. And in light of an unprecedented surge of Israeli violence and aggression in the region. So basically, it looks like Israel is expanding this war. This may be our only option. The state estimates that more than 70% of Iranians are in favor of developing nuclear weapons. I don't, full disclosure, I don't know how accurate that is, but at the very least, this would be a method of saying, hey, everybody else is on board. You guys should get on board too. Mm-hmm. This may simply be posturing to tell Israel to back off and de-escalate. But at the end of the day, we've been hearing for probably decades now that Iran is developing nuclear weapons and 2 weeks away from having a nuke. So I think we could end up seeing at least some movement on it, even though it may be a red line for Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just as a reminder, CIA Director Bill Burns came out just a handful of days ago and said Iran, there's no indication that Iran has accelerated its nuclear weapons program, but he did say they do have a delivery vehicle that's been developed, and he said Iran could potentially here produce a nuclear weapon in a very short period of time, which is, again, it's difficult for me to believe that the Israelis would allow that to happen and then have the Iranians be able to hold that over their heads. All right.
I see a comment here in the chat. Iran just tested a nuke last week. The state media article specifically addressed that, saying no. External sources and internal sources are saying no, we did not test a nuclear weapon. It was just an earthquake. Want to quash that rumor real quick.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Okay.
All right. with that, and by the way, if Iran actually did test a nuclear weapon, that's a clear signal. They're trying to provoke Israel. It would be extremely provocational. All right. With that, we do have some questions for the show today. With the advent of effective, hard to defeat. Oh, sorry, this is a leftover question for Jared. With the advent of effective, hard to defeat anti-ship weaponry, have conventional navies outlived their usefulness, especially in a high-end conflict?
All right. In short, no, but this may redefine what a conventional navy is. First and foremost, maritime shipping is still going to be around. It's still going to require escorts at the very least to protect from pirates. So everybody will need navies. As long as you got a coast, you need navy. However, the advent of hard to defeat anti-ship weaponry, I'm not worried about that in the long term, because it's always a race between the sword and the shield on the naval side. When you had cannons, armor plating, first generation anti-ship missiles, all of these were similarly unstoppable until they weren't. Like, anti-ship missiles were like, how do you defeat that? Until somebody made an electronic warfare suite that could jam the missile. I think it's just a matter of time until effective countermeasures are developed to do that. And part of that may be part of that may be what I've been talking about for I think it's about 2 years now. That Navy will probably shift to a low tonnage ship structure using frigates and proper destroyers instead of running them on carrier bases and running big cruisers. That way, losing one small ship doesn't hurt as much as losing one big ship.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, and just to remind everyone, I guess there's been talk about essentially steerable cruise missiles, or excuse me, hypersonic cruise missiles, things that can reposition and navigate in flight to avoid some of these ship defenses. Is that essentially what we're talking about here? These hypersonic anti-ship missiles that they just get in too close before a ship can react, or exactly what are we talking about here? Just very briefly.
Very, very briefly, I don't think that's quite feasible. The hypersonic's main countermeasure is its speed. It shortens your timeline from under a minute to you have seconds after detection.
Mm-hmm. All right. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. That's one of the things that's a lethal threat to all U.S. Navy, Chinese, insert foreign Navy here. All right. Let's see. Anyone know what Robert's doing? Yeah, Robert checked in last night. He said he was getting a little bit of flooding. That's why he is out today. I'll check in here with him shortly. All right. What are your thoughts about geoengineering and weather modification vis-a-vis intentionally directing hurricanes? All right. I don't believe that's happened. I mean, we're in the middle of hurricane season. These hurricanes happen. We know weather modification is real, and cloud seeding, and I just my thing is prove to me that this is what's happening. I'm not saying it's definitely not happening. I just say I don't think this is the case here. All right. The other morning you mentioned having done a chapter by chapter assessment on unrestricted warfare. Is that material present anywhere? Yes, I believe if you go to the special reports if you go to resources and then special reports on the Early Warning Network app, you can download. We do have that book summary up here for Early Warning Network subscribers. Do you agree that the United States will either end in severe austerity or massive inflation? How do you see this playing out? Ben, great question. I do see this playing out as much higher inflation. It's clear to me that the Fed is eventually going to have to run this country at much higher inflation because they have to inflate the debt away. If your key assumption is that the national debt and the 200 trillion plus in unfunded liabilities are unsustainable, then we have to start looking at feasible courses of action for the Fed. And honestly, I think a 10% inflation over 10 years would reduce the national debt just in it would allow essentially the Fed to print money to pay off the national debt. This is exactly what Ray Dalio is talking about when he says the Fed is going to have to monetize the bond market. This is exactly what he's talking about. The Fed is going to create money, give low interest loans to private dealer banks, and these primary dealer banks are going to turn around and buy these long dated treasuries. So they're going to buy treasury bonds. They're going to keep the government afloat. And so when Dalio says federal debt is not going to be paid off in hard dollars, he's saying the Fed's obviously going to print their way out. And you don't need Ray Dalio to tell you this. We've done this for a long time. So I think at least this is a case where we're going to see inflation. I think realistically, we could potentially be looking at a debt restructuring where the U.S. essentially renegotiates its debt obligations. And it's really tough to say when this will happen or what it will look like. But I would say, yes, at a minimum, your dollars are going to be inflated away. Your wealth measured in, this is another thing that Ray Dalio talks about or has talked about before, just with inflation, right? People see home values going up. They see their portfolios going up and they feel wealthy. And this is also exactly what happened during Weimar, Germany, the Weimar Republic. People felt wealthy because they saw all these dollars, when in reality, their purchasing power was going down. And so really, if you want to measure wealth in the United States, you cannot measure it through dollars. You have to measure it through something else. Base it versus gold, or measure it versus gold. Measure it versus your purchasing power, which is decreasing. So will it end in severe austerity? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's a political will to go in and take a hatchet to federal budgets. I do not think we will choose austerity. We will choose, our politicians will choose mass poverty through inflating the dollar away. All right, everyone, with that is going to do it for today's early morning briefing. Thanks so much for your support. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning and back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.